We are doing an interview about Punya and Papa. That's two concepts, or is one concept that's not so well known in the West, and it's a part of the karma concept, and has to do a lot with donations. And what I found out when I lived in India for 3 years is that there are a lot of sadhus. Everybody who is traveling India as a tourist realizes that. And so you have swamis, you have all kinds of Naga Babas, you have sadhus that you can't really recognize because they don't look like sadhus. And sadhus basically means traveling monk. And the concept basically goes back into the Vedic times, and especially to the time of Shankaracharya, who reformed in my understanding, reformed the Vedas and the Vedic society, and created basically what's today known as Hinduism. So what you see increasingly in India is also that people are getting fed up with wandering monks, because a lot of them are scammers, and a lot of them are not really useful to society anymore. Like everything else, this is also getting corrupted, and then there's the other thing that you can experience since a couple of decades. You see swamis and Indian teachers popping up in Western countries, and they have to somehow also live from something, because in India usually they just wander around, and they get food from people, and they get clothing, and they get free rides on the trains and buses, so basically their traveling is covered, and they just need food and clothing, and mostly it's warm, and they don't need much else, maybe a SIM card. So therefore my question to you now is, since you have been a very well-paid worker in several fields, you're an engineer, businessman, manager, you were very big in development aid also as a consultant. You earned a lot of money, and now you basically gave all your properties. I think you still have a very old car in the US, but otherwise you don't have a house, you don't have an ashram even yet, and basically homeless. Basically homeless, but on purpose, kind of, because it seems to be part of the whole concept of being a swami.
Yeah, there's very many different factors that come into play. You see, if I back up a little bit, one of the things that we have to do as society is that we deliberately have to do good things. And when I say good things, that means we have to contribute to society rather than being a consumer. This is something my guru used to say quite a bit. But it goes back to ancient times where everyone contributed to the world. And by contributing to the world, you gain good karma. That good karma is what we call punya. But then if you actually dependent on society and lived off society, then that would be papa. So if I say, why do they say that is papa? Because basically what happens is you're mooching off society. There's something like a free ride, or taking advantage of society, or even, in modern context, stealing from society.
Like a parasite.
Like a parasite. And as a human being, that is not what we are here for. The only parasites we can have are kids or children up to a certain age, and that also has to stop at some point. But at the end of the day, as a human being, we need to contribute to the world, to the earth, to the well-being of animals, well-being of the environment, well-being of society. And in every act that we do, in that contribution is basically where we gain good karma or punya. On the other hand, if we actually do the contrary to those listing that I gave, then that essentially means we're gaining papa. Now here's the thing, that I can mooch off, or I can steal, or I can take advantage of society right now. I will have to come back and pay up. So there's no way out. given the natural order of things, we as human beings have to contribute and find a way to contribute. But strangely enough, that doesn't apply to swamis, which is very interesting.
Contributing in a material sense now.
In a material sense, because basically there was a structure based on this very fact of Papa Punya. The Hindu tradition or the ancient Indian tradition was essentially that the more you got to know about the tradition and the more you got to know about how the natural order of things exists, then you would actually police yourself. So for instance, if I find out that, or if I know that if I do some harm to a person, that harm will come back to me, I will try not to cause that harm. So this is how we begin to police ourselves in every way. Basically, swamis and teachers of this tradition are assumed to be the moral compass of society, in the sense that because of their understanding, they can guide other people to do what they're supposed to do in order to gain punya, and they're supposed to guide people as to what not to do so that people can deliberately, consciously avoid creating papa.
So basically they're kind of living in the material world, but they are detached from all material duties and can solely focus on the spiritual aspect.
Yes, and now this happened by default, really, in the sense that in order to gain this vision and in order to really, really immerse yourself into the tradition of understanding the vision and the teachings, is that you cannot be distracted by other things. So for instance, if I have kids, then my responsibility as a father is to provide money and education and food for my kids and wife.
But this was, I think it was the case in the time of the rishis still.
Yes.
But of course they lived longer than in the Kali Yuga. So
yeah. Rishis were married.
Yeah, and they were,
so it wasn't so much of a problem, but they had a more detached lifestyle in the sense that it was a spiritual lifestyle. They lived in nature. They ate off nature.
Like fruits.
And so what happened is their lifestyle was in such a way that it was in sync with nature. And because they were in sync with nature, it was easier for them to receive the kind of messages and information they received and then package it, compile it so that we can get it today. The problem is, in the modern day, we don't do that. In the modern day, we're so focused on money or fame or reputation, or even more so, it's like, what is in it for me?
And also life is so complicated. Back then you had a small hut, it was warm, and you could basically eat fruits from the trees, and that's it. So you didn't spend much time on.
Not only that, there was a very cohesive community in the sense that there was a barter system, and that community supported each other. So when you talk about support, it was almost like a social security system that we have in the U.S. or in Europe.
You don't have in the U.S.
Or you don't have. Yeah, in Europe, what happens is you have governments that take care of the roads and they take care of the hospital.
It's very bureaucratic now, no?
So it is bureaucratic.
It was not bureaucratic back then because you just try to see what lacks and then give it. It's like this. I think with hotels, it's quite similar. In India, you had this famous. It has been all over the world, but in India, India's very famous for it that people would not have hotel. There were no hotels before the Brits arrived, basically because people would still travel and then just stand in front somewhere in a village, and somebody would pick them up and give them a bed for the night and food.
Yeah, in fact, there are some villages in South India today that they would not eat until they grab a guy who's walking by and they say, please come eat, because that is part of the culture. So one of the duties of a person who is contributing is to try to feed someone. In fact, the rituals are that they actually feed animals. And so they do this thing called rangoli, where they decorate the house. You find that in India. That's partly you decorate it with flour or you decorate it with rice. So basically by sharing that to the animals, to the creepy crawlers of the earth, you're actually gaining punya.
So you give a dog, a crow, and a cow. I think you have to feed.
So you can feed you can feed all animals, crows, and in fact you get a lot of punya by feeding crows. Imagine that, and pigeons and different animals. So by feeding these animals, and also feeding the earth and plant life, there's also the human life. Now in India there is something where They believe that when a visitor comes in, that visitor is God, and is a representative, is symbolic of God, and so you treat that person the best you can because it's like God coming into your house, and that is a blessing. So for Swamis, again, it goes back the same way. The Swamis, because one, the first thing is that they are committed to studying. It doesn't mean the Swami knows what they're talking about. The main purpose of Swami is to tell society, to say, hey, look, I do not want to partake as a contributor in society because I need to dedicate my time towards studying. And because I need to dedicate my time towards studying, I cannot partake in contributions of society. And that is part of the system, in the sense that everyone at some point in a future life will actually get to the point where they actually need to stay with a teacher or go to the forest and study, gain this vision. Oh. And by gaining this vision, what happens is that there's a lock-in mechanism for allowing these people who study to actually not to seek food or money or shelter, because by doing that, these people have to be fed by society, and by getting the support from society, society gets punya. So for instance, I'm homeless. But it doesn't mean that, and if the other day we were talking about astrology. So if you look at my chart, basically I don't have a home. And even when I did have homes, I never lived in them because that's the way it is in my chart. Now, what does that mean? Is that because I don't have a home, I am obliged to go live in other people's home. And in so doing, I bring blessings in their home.
But the question arises also if a random person would arrive in the home. Is there a difference between a Swami? Because there's a whole lineage behind you, of course, like behind most Swamis. And so there seems to be a special channel that's kind of actively and consciously blessing people and homes. That's part of your job, basically.
Exactly. And part of it is that I become sort of an instrument of channeling blessings to people. And this really works because if you look at the Hindu culture and even the Vedic teachings, is that the entire Vedic teachings and the Hindu culture is based on what is not seen. In fact, it's based on understanding the energies of what is not seen. And the example I usually give is that of electrical engineers. I mean, how do you take in energy from a dam, for instance, and bring it to your home? There's a whole science behind electronic and electrical engineers to sort of monitor and transport the energy. Energy is something that electricity we don't see. But there is a system to manage it. Similarly, the Hindu tradition and the culture is actually dealing with a management system of the of energies that we don't see, but they exist.
Electricity we have not seen until very recently. Now we can see it indirectly. The other thing is that a point of notice is that a lot of the sadhus in India, if they are stationary, then they're usually stationed on rivers and water bodies, because apparently water is some sort of a conduct for these energies, and so there's a lot of sadhus living in caves along the Ganges, or they stand even the Ganges and meditate. So they basically spread through the water, spread the energy or the spiritual charge through the whole country, and that's so the water bodies are kind of the nadis that are like the veins in the human body, and they spread the spiritual nutrients, so to say. Kind of.
So water bodies, actually there's two sides of it. One is it's an element, and secondly there's a subtle element of the water body. So for instance, if you go to Ganges or Varanasi or some of these other places, you find Hindus really look at a water body as one of the deities, because they're not looking at the element, but they're transcending the element to look at the subtle body of the water. And it is a conduit. It is a transmitter of energy. And so one of the things that you find sadhus living by the river is that every morning there's a ritual where they have to kind of dip into the water and then and do some prostrations to the sun and do certain rituals in the morning so that they are purified during the day.
So they basically or to transport the sun energy into the water.
Into the
and
water
charge
and
it.
into the body, yeah.
And I think we have seen that conclusively and quite scientifically, or through the work of Masaru Emoto a couple of years ago, who documented how you could influence water that then was frozen by prayers or by saying certain things, and even writing on a glass of water and leaving it there and then freezing it. And there were very different crystals that he created with this method, and I think that has been replicated by other people as well so far. So that's not the whole science yet, but it shows that this is a valid approach.
Exactly.
So the next thing, of course, that would interest me is, since we kind of know people who have traveled India or who know about India, know how this system works, and it's like a little bit under pressure, and modern Indians are not so fond of it anymore, but it gets very complicated if Indian teachers go to the West or Western countries, because especially since we have democracy here now, and the Protestant societies comes to my mind. This art of donation is kind of got lost, because begging is, to Protestant Christian culture, is something very very much shunned upon, and it's not popular. And of course, I mean, before that you had like the nobility which was donating to the churches, and I mean there's a lot of problems with this as well. But in general, there was some sort of more a culture of donation on an individual level. Now, I mean, we have NGOs and we send money to NGOs, but these are kind of anonymous constructs. They're not human beings in many cases. So there is some sort of a problem, because if you give a lecture in the West as a Swami or a teacher, and you have to travel, and I think that's the main issue, because Swamis now, I mean, you're going to the US in 2 days, and then within 2 weeks or so you fly crisscross across the US, and you have to basically buy plane tickets, for instance.
Okay, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of, it's not only a question of buying tickets, it's a question of spending time to buy tickets, to coordinate who's going to pick me up, who's going to drop me off, where I'm going to sleep. I mean, it's not that I sleep in hotels. And so basically just the amount of coordination that it takes, I basically spend about 50 to 60% of my time just trying to coordinate my travels. And yes, you're right, I'm going to Seattle, and then from Seattle, actually via San Francisco, then I go down to Tampa, and from Tampa then to Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and all of this in 3 weeks, and then I'm back in Europe again, and also then I'll be traveling in Europe quite a bit. So it does take a whole organization to actually get something like this going, and this is something that I've tried to actually create an organization now, and probably hopefully raise funds that I can have other people try to do this for me. And that's typical. In the olden days, there were the students of the teacher who would actually do that. My guru had an organization and had staff to do that, so it makes it a lot easier, so that then I can focus on the teaching. And also on the other side, which we talked about earlier, which is blessing, because part of this is also sharing the blessings of, I'm becoming the conduit of blessings wherever we go. Now, whether you believe it or not, it frankly does exist. And as an engineer, this was something that I did not believe in, but as time went by and the more and more I began to realize how it all works, then I really I began to see the validity in it. It is true, on the other hand, if you look at, for instance, my background and my skills, I could probably make $200 an hour. And if I did that, if I worked for 10 hours.
Just with astrology and or Vastu sessions and things like that.
Just in astrology itself, I could probably make $2,000 a day. But what do I do with that money?
I mean, your main focus is teaching Vedanta, which is kind of the meta science, and you still do astrology, and you do Vastu and Ayurveda, and you kind of charge fixed tariffs for that mostly, I think.
Yeah, nowadays I do suggested donation for those things, because most of the time, I'd spend 2 or 3 hours on a reading and somebody would give me like $20, and that doesn't motivate me to do that. And the other thing is that it's not that people don't want to give, it's just that they don't know.
Yeah, that's a problem, I think, in the West, because people have no clue about the costs. I mean,
Right.
they think you're basically. I mean, if you're stationary somewhere and you're kind of a monk and you live in a small hut at the river, it might be a different thing. But yeah,
There's a confusion actually what I found in the West since I became a monk, that there are two problems. The first one is that Westerners and even modern Indians look at monks as Western monks, in the sense that, you know, if a Western monk is associated to a church or some, and so the church or the organization takes care of the monk,
Okay,
and then as a monk you have to live a particular lifestyle based on Western concept of monkhood. Now that is very different from being a Swami. A Swami, the very fact what a Swami means is that one has no lordship. That means a Swami, the king or the queen or a president has no lordship over the Swami.
and no church.
Yeah, and no church. And basically in the Hindu tradition, the relationship between an individual and God is a very personal matter. So they don't need a mandate from let's say a Vatican or a church or an organization to say how you should conduct yourself with God, or how do you communicate with God. The second thing is that there is no books or some profound book like the Quran or the Bible.
I mean, there's a lot of books, but they're not the last resort. I mean, they're not
Exactly. They do not sanction how one should communicate with God. However, what we have is that we do have specialists who know how to chant or pray a certain way. So when I, or as an individual, want to communicate to God, then I'd go to the temple and I'd ask the priest to actually say certain prayers, because they're trained to do that. Yeah, but it's basically all up to me to go to the temple and communicate to God. So it's my wish or my desire for certain things that leads me to go to the temple, but it's not mandated.
No.
Okay, so when you compare a Western monk to an Indian monk or a Hindu monk, is that we then become sort of these free agents of advising people when they want it. In fact, we are the sort of like the walking encyclopedia if we are well trained, and unfortunately that's not the case. We are the walking encyclopedia, or even the walking conduit of not only blessings but also teachings. So when we find out there's a Swami somewhere, you know, Indians will actually go to the Swami and say, hey, you know, I need some advice. And you find that these Swamis who probably have never been married, they give marital advice. They probably never raised kids, but they give advice to how to raise kids. So it's a bit an oxymoron. But the point is that because a Swami is assumed to be a well-trained monk, in the olden days, no one would become a Swami unless it was authorized by the teacher. But today, it's basically like if I need to be fed, I just put on the orange robes and just walk around and somebody will feed me, because that's how the tradition works. So there is an important, it is important to distinguish someone who is a begging sadhu, which is fine, and someone who is a real teacher. That real teacher is considered a guru. And the dynamics of how you actually donate to these people is actually prescribed in the Upanishads. So for instance, if you want to get more bang for the buck, there's an order which is prescribed. And the first one is that if you give, let's say, $10 to a beggar on the street, you get less bang for the buck. In the sense that when I'm talking about the bang for the buck is in terms of punya. And then if you give money to orphans and to widows, now this is a very Indian concept, because widows were kind of sort of like secluded into a building, and they have become sort of, they don't really become valuable to society anymore. You see this very well depicted in a movie called The Water, I think.
Miranaya, or
no, it was some Canadian producer that really depicted the whole challenge that a widow has. So anyway, they are second in the order. And then finally you have the wandering sadhus, because they become sort of an instrument of receiving donations, blankets and clothes and things like that from society. And in this way they become the omen for other people to gain punya. So if you see them, you give them something, and basically...
This reminds me a bit of, there's a famous book by Saint-Exupéry, not The Little Prince, but one that's called The Citadel, or it's translated as The Citadel, where he talks on a very long, many pages about the use of beggars in society. And he uses, I think, an Arab model mostly, but that basically they show you certain things by just being there. I mean, they show you disease, for instance. They show you age, and they remind you of some spiritual things. And so they have a function in society.
Oh, they have a very important function in society. So, and then the following, where you get more punya by donating the same exact $10, is by giving it to kids. If you look at the Indian tradition, kids would, when they're 6 years old, they would go to study. And memorize how to chant. Okay, so these are kids who are trying to become priests when they get older, and basically they have to spend maybe 12 years learning how to chant. Most of the priests basically have to learn this when they are younger in order to be able to chant the Sanskrit verses correctly. So the students of this get higher. Then again, priests. Okay, so then the priest gets higher. And then again, after that, you have the students of what we call Vedanta, who even get more. If you donate to students who study this teaching, they get more punya. So basically, and then the guru, of course, gets this. So the more you give to, let's say, a teacher of Vedanta, you get maximum punya. And this is basically why I would recommend to a lot of people who would ask me to give it to my guru, because he was the quintessential teacher of Vedanta.
That's an interesting concept. So there are still gurus also, I think, who distribute this wealth, because they, of course, they get most of it, and then they distribute it to their disciples. But at one stage, usually the disciples also leave and do their own thing.
And that basically also, if I focused on just getting money, which maybe I could possibly earn $1,000 a day or $2,000 a day, but then I would not be able to share this incredible wisdom, which is actually priceless. So even if I charged, let's say I charged $1,000 a day for this teaching, it's incredibly priceless. And so people would not come to this teaching without actually having an interest. And so there's a lot of things that I have to do in order to actually spread this information, make this information accessible to people, where I cannot consider living by working. And so I have to seek out donation and support. And by doing that, actually, what I'm doing is I'm also giving opportunity for people to gain punya, which is very important.